about to go live here. We're experiencing some technical issues. I don't have video on you, Scott. So
you do not.
No, let's do this. Why don't you hang up and then call me right back. And what we're trying to do is a little difficult, but hang up, please, and we'll get you connected as soon as we can.
Okay.
Okay, so welcome. So it does seem like perhaps the static is coming from Scott's end. Skype is being real difficult today, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome, everyone. We're going to be talking, of course, with Scott Bennett, former Army Psychological Operations Specialist. See, the thing I don't like about this is now it's coming in with both. Okay, do we have both of you guys?
Okay.
All right, that sounds better. So hopefully we won't have static. And I want to welcome back to the program two gentlemen who have joined me in the past. We've got today Scott Bennett, of course, former Army intelligence officer, former employee of the government contract agency Booz Allen Hamilton, and we're joined again by Captain Dan Hanley, former commercial pilot with United Airlines, and of course, Dan, you're best known to the audience on CrowdSourceTheTruth as a 9/11 whistleblower. How are you gentlemen doing today?
Doing good.
Doing good, Jason. Thanks for having me.
Now, just to clarify, Dan, one of the things I think that people didn't appreciate during our last call was that you are in Pakistan, of all places.
Yes, Islamabad.
Islamabad, Pakistan. So it's a kind of a technological miracle that we've got any sort of video connection at all. And we've been just up until the last minute here before going live working through some of the technical complications of bringing you gentlemen together. Scott, of course, joins us from Northern California, and both of you guys have a pretty unique perspective on an individual we're going to discuss today, a guy by the name of Dov Zakheim. Now, Scott, give us a little background on how you are personally familiar with Mr. Zakheim.
Well, Dov Zakheim was my boss at Booz Allen Hamilton, who was in charge of the terrorist threat financing operations at U.S. Central Command. And I never discussed anything classified, of course, but when I was a terrorist finance analyst working for Booz Allen Hamilton, we looked at all of the areas of operations and the enemies of the United States that were under U.S. Central Command in the Middle East. So it included all of the countries: Egypt, Sudan, Eritrea, Djibouti, Ethiopia, Kenya, Somalia, Yemen, Oman, United Arab Emirates, Qatar, Bahrain, Kuwait, Saudi Arabia, Iraq, Jordan, Lebanon, Syria, Iran, Pakistan, Afghanistan, Tajikistan, Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan, Kyrgyzstan, Kazakhstan, and a few others. So we were looking at all of these countries and all of their financial operations that were being used to aid and abet terrorism. And Dov Zakheim played the most significant role because he was in charge of all of Booz Allen Hamilton's operations and staff. And you know, I went down, and I won't go into too much detail about what's forthcoming in the criminal actions against him, because, as you know, Jason, my case is still being worked out of the court system, and Larry Klayman knows all about it, and others do. But this is a man that I think represents one of the greatest dangers to the United States of America, that really should be executed for treason based on what he did both in 9/11 when he was the comptroller at the Pentagon, and that was one of the reasons I think I was assigned to him by my boss, Colonel Jeff Jones, who was the 4th Psychological Operations Group Commander. Sending me to work for Zakheim was both to explore and expose and fix some of the things that was notoriously wrong with Booz Allen Hamilton's model of making endless profit on endless wars using people that really were, had no real moral code or character. So Dov Zakheim's role in terrorist financing, his role in the Pentagon comptrollership, and some of these other subjects, such as PNAC, and his other companies are all putting him in a position of key suspect for the 9/11 wars and these ongoing American juggernaut operations around the world in the Middle East to
And
dissolve
let me
17
interject for a moment, Scott. When you talk about PNAC, of course, you're referring to the Project for a New American Century, which was both a think tank formed by a notorious array of neoconservative individuals, including Dov Zakheim, including Dick Cheney, Donald Rumsfeld, Paul Wolfowitz, sort of a rogue gallery of neoconservative warmongering individuals who are closely associated with the Bush administration, Poppy Bush's administration, who sadly left the earth before he could face justice in a trial. Reagan's administration before that, which I would argue was largely controlled by George Herbert Walker Bush and his longtime affiliates who are neoconservatives, including Henry Kissinger and all of these sinister individuals. Now, before we go over to Captain Dan and carry on with your explanation, Scott, it's important to note that this Project for a New American Century and the neoconservative, even the Zionist movement, contain people of multiple religions, Jewish people, Christian people. I've been accused of being everything from a Zionist to an Israeli agent, etc. I am not. I will say again for the umpteenth time, I have no interest in defending any country other than the United States of America, and I have a keen interest in bringing those responsible for the events of 9/11 to justice. However, as a Jewish American, I am very sensitive to many of the people around the internet who want to conflate an evil Jewish individual, such as possibly Dov Zakheim, with all of Israel and subsequently all Jewish people. I think if we determine that Dov Zakheim and a collection of Jewish neocons or Israeli neocons or Jewish Zionists are in fact criminals responsible for the deaths of thousands here in New York City on September 11th, as well as millions worldwide in the subsequent wars, that means we've identified evil criminals, not necessarily impugning an entire country or an entire people. So I want to make my position very clear in that regard. Dan, what can you tell us about your firsthand knowledge of Dov Zakheim?
Well, actually, I was reading a Veterans Today article a couple of years ago that was covering Rebecca Roth, who authored 3 books on 9/11. And that was the first time I actually came across Dov Zakheim's name, and the flight termination system referred to it as such. Now you go back to 2006 when I met Phil McConnell. I knew about the Boeing uninterruptible autopilot at that time, and it sort of tied things together for me. And I started researching Dov Zakheim and came up with a plethora of information regarding him. I knew he was a member of Project for 9/11 Century, and they also
New American Century, Project for a New American Century.
What did I say?
9/11 Century.
Shows you where my mind is.
Right.
He was he's allegedly the mastermind of 9/11, and that led me to the article he co-authored in 2000, where he stated that the U.S. needs some sort of a catastrophic event like a new Pearl Harbor to bring people together.
Yes.
And that raised my eyebrows too. Well, that got me to looking into System Planning Corporation, where he was CEO in the year 2000 before he became comptroller, and the flight termination system that his company developed. And if you look at what happened before 9/11, his company sent 32 Boeing 767s to Eglin Air Force Base to reconfigure them as fuel tankers for the Air Force.
Really?
To replace aging KC-135. Now, a little bit later, I hope you show the photographs of the Flight 175 that hit the Pentagon, because I can point out a few things there.
Yes, we will show those. So let's just clarify a couple of points that you're making. So the article that you're referring to is also called the Project for a new American century. It was almost like a manifesto written by this think tank, which Dov Zakheim was part of, and he did author. That manifesto called for a catalyzing event that would enable, something on the order of a new Pearl Harbor that would enable the U.S. government and its clandestine agencies to implement what most of us, I think, would consider pretty draconian surveillance tactics like we've seen through the Patriot Act and all the things Bill Binney has told us about in terms of the NSA, the CIA, the FBI, down to the local police, having access to all of our phone calls, our emails, any type of electronic communication, all under the pretense of trying to prevent terrorism, but they're basically allowed to do whatever they want with our information. And we're seeing now, under the Donald Trump presidency, some of this information and some of these tactics being potentially used by Robert Mueller's special counsel investigation to strong-arm people and to create this, what's called parallel construction. Scott, you've been subjected to this where information is manufactured. We've heard that information can be planted on people, all kinds of things. So, Scott, give us some more background on, so you're saying that when you went to Booz Allen Hamilton, you believe that you were put in there to sort of spy on Dov Zakheim. Is that what I understood?
Well, I'm not going to go into too much of that, Jason. I'm just, because it's still going through the legal processes. But I can say Dov Zakheim was known. He was known by my boss. We talked extensively on my operations, what I would be doing down there, what Dov Zakheim's role was in terrorist financing, and where he was channeling money and assets, and where he was not, and what he was doing and what he was not. And that needs to be kept classified in a certain regard, because it's going to be brought in the legal courts and others soon enough. I'll say this: before I went public in 2014, and really when I broke out of the island of misfit toys that they had put me on when Obama and Hillary Clinton and Eric Holder and Lanny Brewer had illegally and unconstitutionally imprisoned me as a military officer in a civilian prison for a paperwork error, allegedly, and it was to bury a lot of this investigation and processing of Zakheim at Central Command. When I finally got out, and you know the tale, Jason, there's a whole avalanche of things that happened, from Michael Isikoff of the Washington Post, from Tom Hamburger Michael Isikoff of NBC News, then Yahoo News, and then Tom Hamburger of the Washington Post coming up and debriefing me and saying to me, "Why do you think the CIA would do this, Mr. Bennett?" After I never mentioned the CIA in any words up until that point. There is so much that has happened after 2014, but when I went public, the day before my story broke, Dov Zakheim appeared on RT, and he had never popped up in public before or since then. So I think they were really nervous that here's the guy they thought they were going to consign to oblivion, that actually met the whistleblower Swiss banker Brad Birkenfeld, that brought over all of the Swiss banking accounts and Saudi individuals and cell phones and hotel rooms that they were being used in this terrorist financing operation. Dov Zakheim was right in the middle of all that. So when I went down and started digging and processing and reporting and writing and giving lectures and giving debriefings, I saw a lot of the treason that Zakheim and Booz Allen Hamilton are notorious for simply jumbling up in contract language. But there was a lot of misappropriation of funds. Again, going to fund a lot of these Saudi operations in Syria and Libya and elsewhere. And I come back to the reason they did this. We always have to come back to the psychological reasons. The psychological reasons since 9/11 have not changed at all. These people are still deluded with the godless theory that you can go into nations around the world, break them, erase their culture, and substitute a culture, substitute an identity with economic modalities, such as McDonald's or Starbucks or Walmart. They live off of that theory that you can go in and substitute the religious impulses of a Bedouin, desert, Saudi, Sunni, or Persian, or Lebanese, or Syrian culture and people that are thousands of years old. You're going to be able to go in there and instantly lobotomize them and neutralize them into a more passive colony of the United States. That's always been the impulse, and it's never broken. And even it manifests in their attitude and treatment towards Russia, and you see that in their surrounding of Russia and their involvement in Ukraine. And I'm very disappointed sometimes when I see Trump being led down this path by John Bolton and others around him. But it's a psychological warfare template that they are trying. You're right. You said it well. They're trying to control people. They're trying to dominate people. They're trying to do it within the framework of terrorism. It's us against the world. And Trump has said this too. He's not quite inoculated against their poisonous lies because he's regurgitating what they tell him, such as, if we don't fight them over there, we're going to be fighting them here. Really? You're going to have a bunch of terrorists in South Dakota that are going to go against South Dakota people? You think how long they're going to last? You're
Well,
going to
Scott,
have these.
let me just take you back for a second, because even on a sort of, I don't know if this is a higher level or a lower level, but not so much the psychology, but I think the financial motivation is quite clear, because when you talk about Booz Allen Hamilton, you're talking about a contractor to the CIA, the NSA. This is obviously, this is where Edward Snowden came from, and he gave us these revelations about how we're being spied on and everything. And we've heard very recently from Bill Binney, who also was with NSA. He's a 32-year veteran with NSA, and he told us that these guys are motivated simply by money, and that they have a constant need to generate more contracts for themselves. So someone like Dov Zakheim being highly placed in Booz Allen Hamilton, he's a very clear example of one of these people who have been through this political government/private sector revolving door, where someone is sort of oscillating between government appointments on presidential chiefs of staff and advisory boards and things like this, and then going to the private sector, being involved in these think tanks like the Project for a New American Century, and then going back to the private sector, back to the government, back to the Pentagon, et cetera. And these sort of political animals that hover around the government and the military-industrial complex. This is the de facto representation of the military-industrial complex. And it was just last Saturday that Bill Binney was telling me that these contractors are the guys that are dictating where these wars are happening, and they stand to gain to the tune of billions of dollars to perpetuate this stuff. Now, Dan, so a lot of the input that you have for us today is from the standpoint of your background as a professional aviator, commenting on the flight termination system and the Boeing uninterruptible autopilot, et cetera. There are a couple of things that are in the sort of internet sphere of information about Mr. Zakheim that I'd like to separate sort of the fact from fiction, so that if we're going to indict this individual in the court of public opinion, I want to make sure our indictment is watertight. Now, we've heard from various internet sources, although I haven't been able to corroborate this, I don't know how we would. We've heard that Dov Zakheim is a rabbi. Is there any truth to this? Do either of you guys know?
Yes, he is.
How do we know that?
Well, I got it on the internet. The university attended in London, and that he was an ordained rabbi many years ago.
But how do we know that? That's just I've seen commentary on the internet saying that, that's backed up by other people on the internet saying that, but I mean, I've never seen a picture of him dressed in a rabbi's outfit. I've never seen a picture of him presiding over a congregation or reading from the Torah. Certainly, he's been the CEO of some of these military industrial companies. We know that he was one of the authors of the Project for a New American Century, that he's participated in the Project for a New American Century. We know he's part of the Council on Foreign Relations and various other highly questionable think tanks. But how can we find evidence to support this claim that he's a rabbi? Because it seems to me that's another piece that's been introduced to villainize Judaism rather than this individual guy who happens to be Jewish. And it's important to me that we separate these things. If it's true, we should know that. If it's not, we should stop talking about that.
I guess I've read it in so many places that I start believing it to be true. Looking at the universities he attended, I'm not trying to villainize Judaism.
I know you're not. I know you're not. I'm trying to point out a sinister psychological operation tactic that Scott can comment on in a general sense, which is that one person says something, somebody else repeats it, and then it's a natural human instinct to say, well, I've heard this from 5 different sources, it must be true. But in fact, this is the same method CNN, the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, the Guardian, that's the same method they use. The Guardian puts out a nonsense story saying Paul Manafort went and had lunch with Julian Assange inside the Ecuadorian embassy, and then CNN says, hey, the Guardian reported this. The New York Times says the Guardian reported this. And now we've got a lot of sources and a lot of people thinking that Paul Manafort went and visited Julian Assange, but when we check Paul Manafort's passport, there's no evidence that he's even been to London. So I don't think everyone that's attended Yeshiva University is an ordained rabbi, and I've seen no evidence that Dov Zakheim is a rabbi. I've seen a lot of strong evidence that he's a sinister bastard and probably did have something to do with 9/11, and a lot of evidence that he's a devout Jew. And there are criminals, as I've said, in every religious group, every race, every nationality, and I think I want to identify the individuals that played a role in this, and I think it's clear what Mr. Zakheim's motivation might have been. Let me redirect you, Dan, specifically to the flight termination system, and how does that differ from the Boeing uninterruptible autopilot, and how was it used in this scenario?
Well, I believe the Boeing uninterruptible autopilot is employed in the flight termination system according to Field.
Got it.
And for those who are not familiar with the Boeing uninterruptible autopilot, it remotely takes control of an aircraft and can direct it towards a target or land it at a field remotely. And Dov Zakheim, his company, the System Planning Corporation, where he was CEO up until the year 2001 when Bush appointed him comptroller in May of that year of the Pentagon. He was the CEO, and they transferred these 767s to Eglin. Do you have the photo that I sent you regarding the pod on the bottom of the aircraft?
Yes, I do. I have all the photos that you've sent, and they are some very interesting photos for sure. Now, this is where we're starting to get in some hardcore evidence where we see this pod. Now, Dan, for many years, how long were you a United Airlines pilot?
25 years. I had spent 10 years flying the P-3 in the Navy.
In the Navy. So please describe to us, what's the standard procedure for a pilot of any aircraft prior to takeoff?
Always, especially the pilots always do a walk around the airplane, every leg. They get out, and then usually the co-pilot walks around the aircraft. If you're at a maintenance station, a mechanic will do the same thing. And if they would see a pod on the bottom of an aircraft that looked like this, they'd immediately question it.
Yeah, you would not fly if there was anything anomalous like this on the aircraft. As a matter of fact, you're looking for even a small dent in the body, right?
Right, and the underbody of a fuselage on a 767 is pretty smooth. It's got a few probes sticking out.
Pitot tubes and things like that.
When you couple that photo you were looking at, I've seen on the internet photos of what the pod looks like of the flight termination system, and it strongly resembles this pod. And these photos were taken by 4 different people, CNN being one of them, and then there were, I believe, 3 individuals that took the similar photo.
Right.
So when you couple that with the fact that the flight was doing 500 knots, which exceeds the maximum speed of a Boeing 767 by 140 knots, that could not possibly be United Flight 175 hitting the building.
Let me ask you this, Dan. We've heard Field McConnell say that a 767 can do that. It's just by regulation not allowed to do that. What's your comment about that statement?
Well, every airplane has what's called a VNE speed, or a never exceed speed. And the never exceed speed for a Boeing 767 is around 340 knots. And that aircraft was doing 140 knots above that. That's not to say it couldn't exceed 340 knots, but things start happening to the aircraft, and just the induced drag on the aircraft would slow it down. But more importantly, the aircraft could come apart. If you look at Egypt Air, I believe it was 999, I can't remember the exact flight number, where the co-pilot committed suicide by pointing the nose down. It was Mach 99 at altitude before it came apart, but that was at altitude. So there are many who believe, including aircraft engineers, that the airplane could have come apart at that speed. Now, that was a 767. Whether they beefed it up to enable it to do that speed, I don't know. I've tried to research it, and I can't find anything on it.
Well, another really interesting component that you've raised is that you're telling us that as the CEO of SPC, Dov Zakheim, sent, what was it, 30 767s to be retrofit to become tankers?
At least 32.
Where
At
can
least
we
32
confirm that?
Well, I researched it on the internet.
I mean,
and
it sounds
says that a bunch of-
reasonable. It sounds reasonable. I want to find some more information, because I do believe that some form of modified jet was flown into the building. And certainly if the VNE speed for a 767 is 340 knots, there are other aircraft that have higher never exceed speeds, right?
Yes, correct.
So it seems plausible that some kind of engineering could be done to an aircraft to increase the never exceed speed, improve the performance, give it stronger control surfaces, lighter plane, stronger engines, things like this would allow a higher speed, right?
Exactly.
So those could be done.
The other thing I'd like to mention that I mentioned on the previous program is the impossibility of poorly trained, inexperienced pilots haven't flown the airplanes. I flew Cessnas 50 years ago and got my private commercial instrument multi-engine rating, and then flew 35 years total aircraft, including the 757 and 767. And it was in a prayer, those poorly trained pilots, which was the official story, that they were poorly trained, could have flown those aircraft at those speeds. Impossible.
And I think that's something that a reasonable person can come to understand. In our previous interview, Dan, you shared with me the cockpit of a Cessna and the cockpit of a 767. Not to mention, anyone can look at a Cessna and see it's an aircraft that's slightly larger maybe than a big car, and you look at a 767 and it's way bigger than a bus or even several cars of a train. I mean, it's a rough analogy that I've made is it's sort of like saying, you know, my grandmother can drive a modern car with an automatic transmission, but that doesn't presume that she can enter the Indy 500 in a sophisticated race car and win. Now, Scott, I see you doing some research there. Yes, please step in.
Yeah, let me say something. One thing I wanted to point out that we always have to remember, we have to look at the totality of this. And we all know the totality. We know this pertains to the World Trade Center towers, 2 towers going down into a big cloud of dust and smoke. The impossibility of that according to the laws of physics and free fall speed. Building 7. And of course, the Pentagon, we have to look at the Pentagon very carefully because that really is the smoking gun of smoking guns. I know the Pentagon because I drove by the next day and I saw a big blue tarp covering the hole. I didn't see any skid marks. I didn't see any burned grass. I didn't see any upturned ground. I didn't see any wings. I didn't see any Rolls-Royce engines banged into the side of the Pentagon. There was nothing but a big blue tarp covering the hole. So the Pentagon really is the best physical structure to gauge, can a plane, number one, crash into the Pentagon at that speed and just disappear? And anyone who says that, I think, is either trying to deceive us or delusionally ignorant of the laws of physics and a reinforced concrete bunker of one of the strongest military structures ever since America was founded, if not the world. So the Pentagon and the plane that allegedly hit there is something to examine because 9/11 is a very confusing operation. It was designed that way. It was to be full of so many red herrings and confusing parts and misinformation that we, I don't focus on that. I don't make it personal. I don't make it an issue of, well, if I can't believe the planes, then everybody who says that I'm going to get into a fight with, or I'm going to hunker down. No one's going to change me. I didn't discover 9/11 was an inside job until I had been thrown into prison by the Obama people and was surrounded by experts that brought me a lot of the literature that I started waking up to. And I'll tell you one thing, if there's one person on the face of the planet, it's the military person that should be furious beyond words' ability to express when they see that they served for a lie, their friends have been killed for lies, their families have been broken up for a pure lie. That really should transform this country into a massive civil war. It's got nothing to do with anything like other than what you said before. These are criminals. This was the greatest criminal act in the history of civilization. And everybody who played a part needs to be prosecuted and executed for it. And the military should be the first and foremost ones who should be executed because the military personnel that were at the Pentagon had a duty to go down in Humvees to the Congress and say, we've been attacked. And it was not what the president, the vice president, and the people who were occupying the White House have reported it to be. That's what the military is supposed to be, the defenders of the Constitution, the guardians. And instead of that, the Pentagon tucked tail and ran and simply bought into this and participated in the greatest crime. It was a complete cover-up. And that's why, in a sense, we have to have a massive purge in the military. But I just wanted to say we have to come back to the Pentagon and look at the plane, the thermodynamics of the plane. I flew in Cessna 152s and 172s. My father was a Marine Corps combat pilot. My uncle was an Air Force pilot. He flew the KC-135s and the big tankers and stuff like that. And they've both said it's impossible for a plane to perform at low altitude at that speed. A civilian plane, it's just really impossible. Those are like big Greyhound buses. They're not race cars. Otherwise they would cost 20 times the price of what they do. They're designed simply to shuttle passengers like a Greyhound bus. And the moment you deviate from that in the altitude and the speed and the turnings and the maneuvers, you can't do barrel rolls in those planes. They all fall apart because they're engineered that way.
Well, but you've raised a really important point here, Scott, is that 9/11 is an incredibly complicated, however it was done. There are so many facets to it that I agree with you. It's not about hunkering down and believing this theory or that theory. There are multiple different aspects, and we can focus on any one of them or any group of them, but what we want to stay on pretty much today is Dov Zakheim specifically. And so, by introducing all of these confusing elements, you're absolutely right. The perpetrators are laughing their way to the military-industrial bank because we're all here arguing about, was it a plane, was it a hologram, was it an airliner, was it a military jet? Meanwhile, the fingers are being pointed in every different direction. So I'm showing an image right now of a KC-135, which certainly at a distance to a person who's not a pilot or an aviation expert looks like a plane, it looks like a pretty regular plane. And I think we're all in agreement that people like the Air Force...
You don't have the picture up there, Jason. You have a map of the plane.
I've got it on a different screen, Scott.
Yeah.
Let me put it into the screen share. Yeah, the audience can't see what you guys are seeing right now, which I was going to come to Captain Dan on in a moment, but I was just showing this KC-135, whoops, image, and there's my chat going in the background there. They got a lot of different screens going here. Point being, Dov Zakheim is a guy who was at the Pentagon, and we know that Donald Rumsfeld, who participated in this project for a New American Century think tank and the authoring of this document that was calling for a new Pearl Harbor, well, he's connected to Dov Zakheim, and he's connected to George H.W. Bush, and he's connected to the missing trillions of dollars from the Pentagon. So it would seem that all of these guys, if they don't want us to know what's going on with the missing trillions of dollars from the Pentagon, that is a motive. You know, if we're trying to solve a crime, we want to talk about motive, what is it, motive, means, and opportunity, right? So if Dov Zakheim has the means to convert a bunch of jets into military tankers and ostensibly modified jets with possibly more powerful engines, possibly lighter airframe, beefed up control surfaces, it does seem technologically feasible that a plane of this nature could be made to fly fast enough to crash into the building and create that explosion that could be used as part of a psychological operation to convince us all that Muslim terrorists did this, and then create all these side stories that Muslim terrorists or Israeli Mossad or whoever is the hated group of a particular individual's choice can be blamed, when in fact it's a coalition of neoconservative, psychopathic globalists who have straddled the worlds of military-industrial complex, high-level government, unelected positions, and this is sort of the hidden hand that operates behind these elected presidents. What do we think about that, gentlemen?
Well, I would just say one thing. You're right. This is obviously a coalition of criminals and really godless murderers who had this design of transforming the world by igniting Nero's fire and burning down the old Rome that we knew, which was the United States and the Constitution, and erecting this massive police state, NSA state. And they may have had good intentions, but the good intentions paved the road to hell, it's been said, and they've unleashed hell upon the world.
Yes.
And I think the greatest deception operation was done by the devil himself upon the minds of these people, to think that they could get away with this and it would not be taken personal by the United States of America. The American people take this very personally, and they don't even really know about it yet, but it's coming out because of the internet. Now, the one thing I've said before, and I know planes, and I know physics to a certain extent, and I'll defer over to Mr. Hanley to comment on this. If a plane had slammed into the Twin Towers or the Pentagon, would there be massive debris fields? Would there be massive reverberations? Again, you're talking about an aluminum plane with a hollow nose cone slamming into concrete girders with rebar and all sorts of reinforcements. Would they simply disappear into the side of the building like a stone dropped into the water, or would they come apart and explode and bounce off the cement and the steel that really is the structure? It didn't happen in the Twin Towers, and it didn't happen at the Pentagon, which tells me that a plane could not have impacted those buildings without the residual evidence.
Let's talk about that for a second. So let's establish some things first. We gotta address each incident on 9/11 separately. So what happened at the Pentagon is one thing. What happened on the North Tower is one thing. What happened on the South Tower is another. Captain Dan, it's alleged in the official story that it's a United Airlines 767. Flight 175 that slammed into the building. I think the three of us agree that that did not take place. Let's explore for a moment the theory that a 767 supplied by SPC via Dov Zakheim was somehow modified. It was beefed up, or one of these KC-135 or similar type of military jet that to the average person or to a very low resolution image on a video camera looks like a 767 but is not. We've established the fact that it is technologically feasible that such an aircraft could be upgraded to the point where perhaps it could fly 580 miles an hour at that altitude. Right? We agree that that's a technological possibility.
Yeah, but Jason, you keep saying the KC-135, that was the aircraft that was obsolete, that was being replaced by the KC-767.
Got it.
So that's, if you look at the photographs of the aircraft that was flying into the South Tower, you'll see it's got two engines.
Aha.
So.
Okay, so that would make it what, a KC-67?
7, right.
Okay.
So the only way that aircraft could have been used is if somehow they beefed it up to enable it to do that speed and penetrate the building. Now, the last program I was on, Field alleged that just moments before impact, a missile was launched and hit the building, and I can't prove that, but there's a video on the internet that shows a bright orange flash immediately prior to impact.
But wait, let me keep you focused, because there's so many different theories that we could discuss. I don't want to go off of this just yet. The thing I'm trying to zero in on is that we, the three of us, agree that it is at least technologically feasible and therefore a potential possibility that some aircraft, and we're zeroing in on it, a KC-767, which is a military, here's Boeing KC-767. So this is a military configuration of something that's very similar to a 767 in shape. It has two engines, and conceivably, if this plane were totally empty, no passengers, no fuel, and beefed up with stronger engines than normal, somehow stronger control surface, it's conceivable that this could fly substantially faster than a commercial United Airlines jet loaded with fuel to fly from Boston to Los Angeles, loaded with passengers. This could be much lighter and therefore fast enough to go 580 miles an hour, possibly, correct?
Also, Jason, if you look at the picture, the KC-767 has no windows.
Right.
And there were witnesses that claimed the plane didn't have windows.
So we have good evidence to support the theory that a KC-767 could have been used to fly 580 miles an hour into the World Trade Center. Now, I need to locate this video, and I really would like to locate the individual, but I have seen a video interview with one of the architects, engineers, whatever the guy was. He was involved in the design of the World Trade Center. And what he says is the World Trade Center was a unique building in that the center of it was the primary source of the building's strength. All the elevators and support columns were in a strong central core, and that the exterior of the building was sort of strengthened by a steel mesh that gave it torsional rigidity to resist sway and twist, and strengthened it from the outside, but was essentially like a screen door, and that an airplane crashing into it was like a pencil being pushed through a screen door, and that this design was devised specifically to protect against to withstand, to absorb the impact of a plane. So my question for you, Dan, as a pilot, do you have any firsthand experience with collisions at speeds like that? And how does a plane perform when it's going 580 miles an hour? It's generating so much kinetic energy because the mass,
right,
1/2 of the mass of the plane, which is approximately 200,000, 400,000, some very heavy weight, times the velocity of 580 miles per hour squared is tremendous impact hitting that building. Do you think it would crash through?
I do, but I get arguments all the time on Facebook and elsewhere that it was physically impossible because of the structure of the building, and also that there was no wreckage found outside the building. But the way I look at it, it would be like cheese going through a grater. it would disintegrate at that speed with that much momentum.
Yeah, I mean,
And
an
it's made of
analogy that I've often
aluminum.
made, just real quick, Scott, an analogy I've often made is if someone just taps you with a pillow, it's pretty soft. If somebody winds up and swings a pillow at your head, it could hit you and hurt. If someone were to launch a pillow out of a cannon and it hit you at 500 miles an hour, you would surely be killed. So that's a demonstration of kinetic energy that I think a lot of people can relate to, and it demonstrates that it doesn't matter what the material is. There are other physical aspects to this calculation, and I haven't been able to yet locate a physicist who can give us the proper method for calculating this, but I think that's what we need to do, otherwise we're speculating.
Right.
Yeah, I would agree with you on that. And that's something that needs to happen. I mean, in a sense, you need to rebuild a section of the World Trade Center tower and fly an airplane or a model of it with the same proportions and engineering and metallurgy into it to determine
That'd be hard.
what exactly physically happens. And the only thing I would say again is airplanes are made of aluminum. They're not made of steel. The engines are made of steel, but everything except parts of the landing gear are aluminum, and the wings are hollow. So wings, even at a tremendous speed, hitting rebar, steel, and concrete are going to break off. They're not going to slice into a building as if they are lightsabers.
Well, until we can
butter.
get a physicist involved, I think we should stay away from our personal feelings about what may or may not happen. Scott, let's go back to your previous comment about this flight path going towards the Pentagon. Now, this takes us back to this discussion about Dov Zakheim. We know that so if he's got these planes that have been upgraded to KC-767s, perhaps that's a tool that could be used at the World Trade Center. Let's talk about the impossibility of this flight path here at the Pentagon. Dan, what we're looking at here, is this something that's even within the performance profile of an expert pilot piloting what jet is alleged to have hit the Pentagon? Also a 767 or a 737?
757.
Okay, so let's talk about that.
American 757, yes. First of all, the hand flew the pattern. Second of all, these poorly trained and inexperienced pilots were able to arrive over the Pentagon from the north at 7,000 feet, do a corkscrew 330-degree turn at 500 knots, and like Scott had mentioned, they miraculously hit a few feet above the building's foundation without skidding the surface. It's absurd. The whole story is absurd.
Now,
And
you've sent me another photo, Dan, that talks about some of the aerodynamic forces around a jet in flight. Can you talk about this
Right.
for a moment?
the upper photo is an aircraft normally in flight, and the wings actually create these vortices. When you get down, the closer you get to the ground, the more they're compressed. And it actually reduces drag, which would increase the speed of the aircraft, but it also gives a cushioning effect to the aircraft. So for probably these inexperienced pilots to have gotten down into what they call ground effect and been able to hit the building that low is an impossibility in my mind.
So it's an aerodynamic impossibility because these vortices would a plane be able to fly that low to the ground, or wouldn't this aerodynamic disruption cause it to not fly?
Well, airplanes land that way.
But not at speed, not at 580 miles an hour.
No, but you can still enter into ground effect, and sometimes it causes the airplane to float down the runway. So ground effect's always there. But they were doing 500 knots.
Ground effect is the cushioning effect of these vortices and the aerodynamic impact of the plane itself, giving it this cushion bouncing off the ground?
Exactly. Just like the photo shows there.
But normally when you're landing an aircraft, don't you need to fly very close to the stall speed to avoid this type of interference from ground effect?
Yeah, above the stall speed. But like I said, sometimes if you float a while down the runway, you attribute it to ground effect, just these vortices that are formed on the bottom of the wing.
So the thing I'm getting at is normally when you're approaching a runway and the plane would enter into ground effect or possibly enter into ground effect, what's a typical speed that you're traveling?
It depends upon the weight of the aircraft and the type of aircraft, but you're normally doing about 140 knots, 135 knots.
Okay,
And
so
that
here's
is,
another. Well, here's another
Go ahead.
aspect we can evaluate as non-physicists. So if we've got, in the case of the World Trade Center, a plane going 580 miles an hour that crashes in one side and stops there in the building, and then we've got, in the case of a Pentagon, a plane that is allegedly flying through 6 layers of concrete in a building that's designed to be a bunker, not just a mere office building, how could it possibly do that if at 580 it's penetrating essentially one wall of concrete, and it can't possibly be going 580 that close to the ground? It would be going at a much lower speed, but yet it seems to be penetrating much deeper into the Pentagon.
Right. Well, I can't prove it, but I believe it was a missile. We won't know until the FBI releases the cameras. The one that was at the DoubleTree Hotel. There was another one that the Virginia Highway Patrol captured, and the third one on the gas station roof.
Right.
And the FBI went in and immediately confiscated those cameras. And they've only released a few video footages of something hitting the Pentagon.
Right.
And it was traveling so fast, you only capture a few frames of what it is.
Yeah.
Robert Mueller was the one who did that too, Jason. I mean, again, we're entering a twilight zone world of massive corruption. The
Right.
photographic evidence, the physical evidence, is really all that we have to go by. We can theoretically speculate with great education about the physics and the realities of a plane hitting a bunker. But the absence of a plane material at that bunker site justifies and I think supports the theory of a missile. And then you look at Dov Zakheim and his comptrollers that were examining $2.3 trillion that were actually being siphoned and sent to various parties, some of whom were identified by people at Booz Allen as potential Middle East players, whether you want to call them Mossad or Shin Bet or the Likud party or Netanyahu's mercenary forces. Dov Zakheim played a key role in that he was in charge of the comptrollers, and the area of the Pentagon that was allegedly hit was being filled with auditors from the Office of Naval Intelligence looking into some of these financial aberrations. The other thing about Dov Zakheim is his son, Roger Zakheim, was one of the lead counsels at the House Armed Services Committee when I was filing my reports about Dov Zakheim and Brad Birkenfeld and Shell Game. And then he left and became an attorney for Covington and Burling,
Yeah.
which was playing a part in all of these terrorist financings and Clinton Foundation pay-to-play and Saudi operations. Saudi Arabia was the key pawn that the neocon, Project for a New American Century types have classically used for destabilizing the Middle East. And it's one of the greatest Pandora's boxes that we've ever opened, because the Saudis have been the ones that were in Libya. They've been the ones going up into Syria. They're causing all sorts of instability. And Dov Zakheim and all of this, all of these operations and the financing of terrorism really comes back to it. And again, I worked also at the Heritage Foundation, and Dov Zakheim was at the Heritage Foundation. And
What's your impression of the Heritage Foundation, Scott?
Well, I liked a lot of it because I worked in some of the domestic family policy areas, but the defense areas, the more militant areas were dominated by neocon, Zionist, and that has nothing to do with being Jewish, but the Zionist mentality of we need to drive out these Middle Eastern sort of cultures that are so antiquated and problematic that the only solution is a complete transformation through military means. The Heritage Foundation were riddled with those sort of thinkers. I knew several of them Some of them were were sent over to Homeland Security.
You're
I was
making
sent
some
over to
very,
Bush.
very important points here, Scott, and I'm glad you're bringing these things up. The connection between Dov Zakheim, the incident at the Pentagon, for all we know, the World Trade Center may have been a distraction from the attack on the Pentagon. As a matter of fact, there's a lot of reason to believe that it was. That's not to say that's the only reason it was executed. I think the destruction of key individuals at Cantor Fitzgerald, the destruction of the building itself, the impact that it had on the SEC and what actions it took on September 12th. These types of complex operations typically have many, many objectives, lots of redundancy, because I think they know anytime something this complex goes into motion, it's never going to be 100% successful, and it's never going to come off exactly as planned. So they need a lot of redundancy, a lot of distraction. And the fact that they have key individuals in different places doing different things is also very important. You know, there's been a lot of reporting, even in the mainstream news lately, guys, about Prime Minister of Israel, Benjamin Netanyahu, and what's next. There's been this corruption scandal going on in Israel to the extent that even Israeli police are now calling for charges against Netanyahu in this third corruption case. Now, I don't have any firsthand information on what's going on with Benjamin Netanyahu. No Israeli police have contacted me. No one who's worked for a contractor to the Israeli government has contacted me in the way, Scott, that you and I communicate. So I try to keep the things that I bring to people's attention here on Crowdsource the Truth. I try to keep it limited to stuff that my guests have firsthand experience with. In this case, of course, Captain Dan worked for United Airlines and has detailed firsthand knowledge of how aircraft perform, what United Airlines was doing and reacting to with regards to his statements about 9/11. And of course, Scott, you've got extensive firsthand experience as a contractor to these intelligence firms and even working for some of the individuals that we're talking about. So the input from you gentlemen is invaluable, but I don't want to really speculate beyond what we can surmise from the things that you guys are telling us. Now, we're almost out of time for today, but I think we should have more.
I can say one thing. The
Yes.
contractor people treat this whole thing like a game, like it's an endless contract, and it sickens me beyond words to see people wearing the military uniform retire to go right into the contract world at Booz Allen Hamilton or SEIC and treat this whole thing like it's an endless game. They're chain-smoking drunks, whoremongers who are hanging out at MacDill and elsewhere in D.C., and it is not a blood fight. They're not fighting. They're not putting on the uniform. They've retired, but young kids are. But I can say with authority, this dominates the military-industrial complex. People that are in this for nothing more than a career and money and lots of money, and it's very infuriating. So I can say with authority, these military-industrial contractors that you're talking about, these generals and admirals that leave the Pentagon, they go right in, and all they do is move food around on the plate, move paper around. They don't invent anything. They don't create anything. They just suck money out of the government for these endless wars. Wow. And I saw it.
I think you're right. I think you're right, Scott. I do want to remind everyone that, you know, they can purchase Scott's book. He's written a number of books, actually, but Scott is most known for his book Shell Game, in which he describes the mechanisms and essentially the shell game that is used to finance some of these terror operations. Scott talks about his time not only at Booz Allen Hamilton, but also as an Army intelligence officer. And he's revealed some stunning information. You know, a couple points you also brought up, Scott, about Covington and Burling. We should mention, this is the law firm that's representing General Michael Flynn, and we're all awaiting the information that Robert Mueller's special counsel investigation will bring about Michael Flynn's sentencing, of course. But it's just interesting to note the links between Dov Zakheim, Roger Zakheim, Covington and Burling, General Flynn, who has said that it was a deliberate intention on the part of Barack Obama and Hillary Clinton to create ISIS. Hillary Clinton has said Saudi Arabia and Qatar are funding ISIS. We know the United States, Israel, and others are in the regular practice of using these proxy armies that are essentially jihadis, rebels, random mercenaries who are there, who the Moriartys have told us will commit horrendous atrocities basically for fun and money. And this is a huge problem that we want to close in on. I want to dispel the Muslims did it, Israel, Jews did it, whoever. I want to get through all of that and get down to the brass tacks of who are the individuals. I don't care what religion they are. I don't care what race they are. I don't care what government they work for or pretend to work for. I want to know who did it. I want to know how they did it. I want to know why they did it. And I want them to be brought to justice. Dan, do you have any closing words for us before we wrap it up today? I definitely want both of you guys to come back, and in the future perhaps we can expand to a larger panel. There's so much to be discussed here. What can you leave us with, Captain Dan? Dan, have we got you?
This is yeah. Can you hear me, Scott?
Yes, you're back.
Okay. I don't know if this is the appropriate program to bring it up, but the Lawyers Committee for 9/11 Inquiry, are you familiar with that?
Yes,
Yeah,
talk to us
yeah.
about that a little bit.
Okay. The group of lawyers nationwide got together with architects and engineers for 9/11 Truth, scientists for 9/11 Truth. There's even some of the next of kin from the victims of the Twin Towers. And they petitioned the New York prosecutor to convene a grand jury to investigate all their findings and determine culpability. But as you know, and that's ongoing right now, but as you know, grand juries are very secretive. So when I think about the jurists have the ability to request the prosecutor to subpoena anyone before them, I'm only hopeful that Larry Silverstein, Dov Zakheim, and everybody else involved in this are brought before the grand jury so they can explain themselves.
Yeah,
Amen.
I agree. I agree with that completely. Gentlemen, I want to, sorry.
They're the only legal act in town right now.
Right.
You know, I
And
hear
this is-
everybody arguing on the internet about what happened. Where are you going to take the information? But Trump isn't going to open another investigation. Architects and engineers have petitioned Congress to open the investigation. So this is right now the only act in town where they can legally do something.
Yeah.
Yeah, and this is important. We're going to all keep our eyes on this. Gentlemen, I want to thank you both for joining me today. This is, of course, an ongoing conversation, one of the most important conversations we can have. And we will be back with you guys in the future tonight at 7 p.m. only on Patreon. We're going to have another episode of the Intelligence Assessment with Kevin Shipp. We're going to be exploring George H.W. Bush and his background in the CIA. So make sure you get onto patreon.com. Patreon.com/CrowdSourceTheTruth. I want to thank my guests, Captain Dan Hanley and Scott Bennett. Gentlemen, it's a pleasure speaking to you as always. I look forward to our next conversation.
Thank you, Jason. Thank you, Dan.
Thank you, Jay.
And thanks
Thank
everyone
you,
for
Scott.
watching.